What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a revised review for Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, a game I have reviewed once previously, but with this retrospective I'd like to do a couple of things. One, revisit the game, obviously, before the release of Bloodlines 2 next month, and also update an old video I made about Bloodlines, obviously, that I don't think was very good, frankly. Not my favorite review of my own that I've done for sure. And with Bloodlines being such an important game to so many people, it felt like the appropriate time to sit down and revisit it, while hopefully shedding light on it for somebody ahead of the second game's release, while getting into essentially everything there is to know about this thing. So with no further ado, let's do exactly that. Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines is a game that initially released in 2004, and as many people are aware, it was notoriously buggy, in some cases unplayable, leading to a game that was quite broken and certainly contributed to the swan song of Troika Games, the company that developed the game, as this was their very last title out the door. But that is not all of the story there. Because while reviews were pretty harsh on the bugs, as you would imagine, a lot of people did, even at the time, mention how good the game was if you could actually play it. So it's probably no surprise then that it found its own version of a second chance at life later on via things like community support and especially one unofficial patch that is holding the thing together all these years later. Nonetheless, though, the game itself was developed in the Source engine. Now that is important because they had a contract with Valve to use the Source engine, and part of that contract was basically that Bloodlines could not be released before Half-Life 2. For this reason, the game was actually not initially intended to launch in 2004. The initial release window was spring of 2005, which would have accomplished two things, being past Half-Life 2, of course, but also providing quite a few more months to actually work on the game and improve things. And in fact, listening to the interviews of most developers, such as Leonard Boyarsky as an example, have stated that about 3 to 6 more months worth of full development time would have made quite the difference for them. However, following its release in November, pretty much all of Troika's staff was laid off in December, and so it never really got any post-launch support to bring things up to speed, as you would probably imagine, even though there were some attempts, but without further funding from the game's publisher, Activision, it just wasn't going to happen ultimately. Now, you may be wondering then, well, why didn't they release in spring? So this is apparently a decision that Activision made. As with most cases, almost certainly due to money, insisting that it release in November 2004, and then the earliest that could contractually happen was the exact same day as Half-Life 2. This led to disastrous sales, selling 72,000 copies upon its initial release, as an example, and all of those factors together are why Bloodlines initially had an incredibly rough go of it. And yet, very importantly, the people who did play it enjoyed it enough that they were inspired to continue patching it via unofficial patches and mods on their own end, which led to the birth of the Unofficial patch. Mostly the work of one guy who goes by Wesp5 online, or I believe Werner Spall is his actual name. This individual continued to work on patches continuously up until one very recently. I believe the most recent update was like last year, in 2024 or something like that. In fact, they've been working on this for so long that it has kind of a life of its own, independent of the game as well, because these days the Unofficial patch comes in two forms, the basic patch or the plus patch. And that's to say nothing of the other mods available, but basically what started out as attempts to fix obvious bugs and things like that eventually sort of evolved into an effort to do things like restore cut content or things that weren't actually implemented fully, and then later into balancing and approaching some of the busted combat, things like that we'll get into in this very review. Now this is important to mention because I personally am playing this on the Plus patch. Most of the footage you're going to see is on the Plus patch, and that is important because exact names of certain individual things may change here or there. Some options only show up in the basic version as an example. And as a general recommendation, I would strongly recommend you play the basic patch first and then play the Plus patch after that if you'd like to continue. This is because you can sort of see the game as close as you can get to its intended experience. With the Plus patch, as mentioned, being the version that restores all that cut content, rebalancing things, bringing back old levels, but even today, the quality of some of that stuff is a little hit or miss. Most of it's pretty good because it's been worked on for so long and it's seen iterations and updates and stuff, but a lot of it is ultimately subjective. It was not necessarily intended to be there. Like, for instance, they've restored entire missions, like one that sees you fighting a member of the La Sombra clan as an example, and in order to even make that, they had to get some information from one of the developers, and then they went and scoped out the area it was supposed to be based on before implementing it fully into the game, and even today it's still a little buggy actually. So when looking into installing the unofficial patch, it's important to understand the differences between the basic and the plus version. Probably also worth a mention then about Steam versus GOG. So Steam sells the regular version of the game basically, the retail edition. GOG on the other hand actually bakes a version of the unofficial patch in. It's not the most up-to-date one. I think they use version 11.1 and the most up-to-date is 11.5. But basically, if you want to use the patch and not actually have to install it or worry about that, GOG is the way to go. The Steam version works fine in the sense that you can install the patch over it and get all these fixes and everything as well, because without it, there's a huge chance you won't even necessarily be able to finish the game, and then even if you do finish the game, it's likely going to be a less than fantastic experience, even if it's not outright unplayable. Even then, however, the unofficial patch isn't the only mod for this game, mind you, so there are a whole host of other mods that in some cases have been designed to work with the unofficial patch. Probably, I would say some of the biggest ones being the Clan Quest mod, the Companion mod, and then there's even another one called, I think it's Antitribu, I'm never sure how to pronounce that. That adds a bunch of other clans and content and things to explore along the way. So even beyond the plus patch, there is plenty of more content to see purely through mods. And you can't really mention this game's longevity without mentioning those specific things, because where this game sold initially very poorly, it has since become a bit of a cult phenomenon, a cult classic obviously, but in particular, estimates put it on Steam having sold well over 1 million copies at this point, and for a game that flopped pretty hard and led to the demise of its studio, or at least contributed to it, that is not an insignificant resurgence over the years. All of that little history lesson out of the way though, let's first talk character creation, since that's the first thing you are likely to see. Now, straight away, you're going to see some differences between the basic and plus patch here. The plus patch even lets you play as a vampire hunter, or at least a few missions as one, via the Society of Leopold. That's a completely optional side thing. I'm not going to cover it here, but the other thing the plus patch adds to character creation really is the option of taking a history or a background, which can like mess with your stats a little bit here and there, which isn't really necessary, but can be fun if you're looking for a change of pace. But otherwise, the main thing you're going to do here is change your clan and then pick some basic skills and stuff. So you can do this by completing a quiz, which will just give you your clan if you're unfamiliar with what the clans are, which is honestly not a bad starting point for most people if you want to go down that route. But you can, of course, just pick your clan outright if you prefer, from the game's 7 available options. However, your clan is a very important choice. It's going to dictate a lot, mainly dialogue options and then a few other unique things. I would say it can be divided into the 4 like sort of core clans, and then the other 3 are a little more unique with some more interactions. On top of just this screen, however, some other things you may want to pay attention to here are your humanity and those masks up at the top right. So humanity is basically how close your vampire is to succumbing fully to a monstrous beast. This actually results in the loss of control of your character via beast checks. When you are running low on blood and that vampiric origin starts craving blood, that's represented in-game by you essentially turning into a feral monster unable to control yourself. Doing this in public leads to masquerade violations, which are the masks. The more humans are aware of you, the more things like vampire hunters may come after you, up until you are just straight up murdered for having violated the masquerade. So don't succumb fully into being a beast, so you don't go feral. Otherwise though, let's talk about the different clans. There are Bruja, Ventru, Toreador, and Gangrel, which I would consider the main 4, and then there are Tremere, Malkavian, and Nosferatu, with Malkavian and Nosferatu being quite a bit more different than all of the others. Now, each of these effectively is a flavor of vampire, if you are unaware. If you're thinking like a suave, seductive vampire that is typically the depiction you would see in most media, that's a Toreador. And a Toreador or Bruja are what I would probably recommend for like a basic playthrough. Bruja because they get a lot of combat disciplines and things like that that just make combat easier, and in a game where combat is not great, they can be pretty good and helpful there, especially once you're getting to grips with how things work. Toreador are, again, sort of that iconic vampire, and they do great in the first couple of acts where there's a ton of social interactions, but when the back half of the game kind of devolves into more of a combat-oriented experience, the Toreador can suffer a little bit if you haven't been investing into combat, but even then, this can be overcome if you're expecting it, as one of their powers, celerity, is very good. In any event, though, understand that outside of playstyle, one of the biggest things this is going to change is occasional bits of dialogue and how people talk to you, which can make certain things easier or more difficult. Even with that in mind, you are able to see, I would say, probably about 90% of the actual events in a single playthrough, especially if you're doing things like save scumming. There's a couple of things here and there that you would probably have to actually reload to see, and then stuff like the Malkavian dialogue, which is entirely different, or the Nosferatu, who get called out for being, kind of gross, is certainly pretty common as well. There are still some unique things you need to be aware of, like, for instance, Vinshru are basically like the high-class vampires. These are the ruling class, if you will, and as a result, they can't drink from low-quality blood sources, which basically means no rats, no prostitutes, and no homeless. It will actually cause damage to them to do so. You need to feed from basically just regular individuals or blood bags, things like that. Gangrel are loners, but they get access to some interesting disciplines that the others do not, or at least for the most part, such as Protean or Animalism. But basically, Brujah, Vinshru, Toreador, and Gangrel, those are, I would say, the pretty stock standard playthroughs. They can, if they brown-nose the prince, get an extra haven or like a safe place as an apartment in downtown, as an example, and they have access to the widest range of possibilities just sort of by default. Now, the other three still have access to pretty much all of that stuff, mind you, but they do play a little bit differently in some important ways. Now, Tremere are worth singling out because these guys are blood sorcerers. In particular, they did not come from the typical bloodlines, but rather they stole the secrets of vampirism through magic, which has then now turned into their unique discipline of thaumaturgy, which is essentially blood sorcery. They're the only characters that can use it, and being able to use it comes with the trade-off of not being able to raise physical attributes above 4, but honestly that is meaningless as their thaumaturgy is crazy strong. Especially if you go through the hassle of getting their unique haven, which is available to them at the Tremere Chantry in downtown, which comes with a special little amulet you can get that makes it even stronger. So they get that unique power, but they also get some unique dialogue, and aren't really fully trusted by the other clans as you would probably expect given their origin. But Malkavian and Nosferatu are where it get especially interesting. So Malkavian is the only clan to get the dementation power that they can use themselves, so they get something unique just the way the Tremere do with thaumaturgy or the Gangrel do with Protean, and like Nosferatu they can also potentially turn themselves invisible as well. But what makes Malkavian unique is that they've been touched by madness in some way. Each and every one of them has some level of mental disturbance that makes them unpredictable and potentially very dangerous. Now, what this means in terms of gameplay is that all of their dialogue is unique. A lot of it leads to the exact same places and is, for the most part, just changed for the sake of flavor, but in some cases, this can actually lead to things that are direct references or even, in some cases, spoilers if you understand their meaning, because they get a lot of insight about what is about to happen. Because of this, I would generally recommend people play Malkavian like for a second or third playthrough, but if you're only going to play the game once and you know that for a fact, Malkavian can be a good way to go, but just understand that some stuff you see is going to be unique to them. Another thing, for example, is like a lot of like the power lines and stuff in the background do like this crazy wavy thing when you're playing a Malkavian. And so they get a lot of unique dialogue and reactions to them as an example. But then there's also the Nosferatu. The Nosferatu look hideous, simply put. They do not look good. That is their big curse. They are very powerful, however. They get a lot of really strong disciplines, the ability to turn invisible via obfuscate, potence, which just straight up makes them stronger, and then the animalism. But because of their appearance, they actually have to mostly avoid humans. The easiest way to do this is stick to the game's sewers, which are in every hub area. They also have an appearance of 0, which cannot be raised higher, so they can't raise some of their stats past a certain point, which is pretty hard if you're trying to do things like seduce people. However, this is not as bad as it initially sounds. You don't have to stick to the sewers in their entirety, but you do have to maintain a certain distance between you and other people, because it can be a potential masquerade violation, and thankfully, at least, The NPCs you actually have to talk to, you're not going to have to deal with that too much, but just be aware of it. It does feel pretty unique as a result of that. But on the plus side, they do gain a lot more blood when feeding on rats, which is very helpful for one particular part of the game. And what's more, they actually also get a unique haven if you play long enough. With that discussion of clans out of the way, though, let's next talk about their different powers and abilities. And rather than do this by each individual clan, we're going to talk about what each discipline does very generally, as some of them overlap, but each clan gets 3 disciplines, or varieties of blood powers that they can use. Animalism effectively lets you summon in animals to do your bidding, be that ravens, beetles, wolves, swarms of bats, the usual suspects. It gets stronger as you go, as you would imagine. Auspics is a very common one. A lot of the clans get auspics, and this is essentially just a buff for a set period of time that gives you more wits and perception, which can increase certain stats, which can be helpful if you're trying to do things like, say, hack or something. It will also, by default, let you know what is and is not human or undead in front of you, which can be helpful for non-necessarily implicit gameplay reasons. There's next up Celerity. Celerity just makes you move much, much faster. Its max rank is notoriously busted because the entire world moves incredibly slow. This is the power that saves Toreador, I think, towards the end of the game, as they can max this out and become very strong while also focusing on their social stuff by giving themselves enough time to move. Dementation, the unique Malkavian power, gives you a variety of debuffs to the enemies around you. At level 1, it will just cause the victims to laugh uncontrollably. Level 2 actually debuffs enemies by hitting them with a -2 to all combat feats. Visions of Death can just straight up kill regular humans, and then can just deal damage here and there to regular foes, but then stuff like the max level Bedlam, it will randomly inflict one of the lower levels as an example. So there's some variation to how that one plays out. Dominate, the power of the Tremere and the Ventru, is pretty much what it sounds like. You force people to do what you want. This takes the form of either dialogue options to use it in dialogue, or an actual discipline that you activate in combat, which will typically order targets to just straight up die, either solo or in mass, or even force them to defend you before they just straight up die, or at very low levels completely take them out of a fight, as an example. Fortitude just makes you damage resistant by increasing your soak, which is your damage reduction. Obfuscate basically just gives you various forms of turning invisible via that either motionless at level 1 or while crouching. Later levels give you bonuses to sneak attacks, things like that. Potence just gives you extra damage to unarmed and melee. Presence gives a huge debuff to everybody around you. And then Protean, the gangrels thing, kind of shifts their form to be more animalistic, kind of like a werewolf, but not exactly, giving them a whole bunch of extra damage via their claws, as an example, so another really offensive one. And then lastly, the Tremere's Thaumaturgy, which can just be firing a bolt of blood or boiling someone's blood and exploding them all over everybody else, potentially killing them as well at the very end. So there are a wide variety of different vampire powers here, and each clan is going to have 3 of those that we've mentioned up to this point. Now, as you would probably guess just from that, not all of these are made equal by any stretch of the imagination. Some of them are a lot more effective than others. Celerity is really, really good. Thaumaturgy's final rank is really, really good. Potence can be super useful for melee builds or unarmed builds, which is probably, I would say, one of the better forms of combat in here as an example. But stuff like Presence and even Auspex, I mean, they're alright in certain situations, but they're hardly make or break. So just understand that not all of these are made equal. But with all of that stuff out of the way, we may as well go ahead and talk about the rest of progression since we are already here. And honestly, it's not very complicated. Basically, as you complete quests specifically, you don't really get experience from doing anything like combat as an example, but rather completing quest steps or finding hidden things will give you experience, and it's relatively small amounts of experience, usually like 1 to 3 points in most cases, sometimes a little more, and you're going to use that experience to put blood points on your screen here. Honestly, the numbers stay simple, and then it will tell you what increasing each one will increase over on the side, and then for disciplines, it of course adds that ability for you to actually use from your active list. Now this can feel a little overwhelming because there's a lot of stuff here, but once you know what each individual thing does, it's really not that bad. But keep in mind, again, not all this stuff is super useful, and the later part of the game really focuses heavily on combat. But if you're doing everything especially, you should absolutely have more experience than you need to play a particular way. In fact, if you have the Plus patch installed, you're going to have a nonsense amount of XP, and even without probably trying to, it's pretty easy to have massive stats without even doing anything like, say, min-maxing as an example. Now, rather than explain each individual thing, basically putting points into these dots will then increase the things on the side. Let's talk about those individual skills. Unarmed means, of course, fighting with your bare fists. This starts off really good and useful, but by the late game, I wouldn't recommend it unless you're using the Plus patch, which has some weapons specifically for it. Melee is things like your bladed weapons for the most part, but occasionally other weird things like, say, severed arms. But basically, if you're picking up and actually using a weapon outside of like claw weapons, you are using your melee skill. That's an important distinction. Ranged, of course, means what you are doing with firearms. You can pick up and use a lot of firearms, and while they are not necessarily useful in all situations, some enemies are actually very good about being resistant to this type of damage. It can still be fairly useful, but personally I think melee trumps it just in raw effectiveness. And then we have defense. Defense is your ability to avoid taking damage when you are in combat. This is to avoid it altogether. That's different from damage reduction, which we'll talk about in a minute. Lockpicking is self-explanatory. You need to meet certain minimums to lockpick doors. Sneaking reduces your chance to be spotted. Sneaking is one of those things that's all over the place. It's either really good or it's really bad. At a low level, you'll be spotted almost instantly, even in situations where it doesn't make a lot of sense and it's hard to figure out what to do to avoid it, but at a really high level, you can practically walk right in front of people. Hacking is your ability to just automatically guess the passwords on computers. This can be bypassed entirely if you just know the passwords already, if you want to play through a second time, as an example. Inspection is the likelihood that hidden stuff will show up, which is to say be highlighted in your vision without you necessarily knowing it's there. This is another one that can be bypassed simply by knowing the stuff is there. Research is an especially interesting one because that gives you the ability to read research books, which require other minimum stats to actually use, and if you plan for it, research can give you a ton of stats this way via skill books, and is definitely something that benefits min-maxing a lot. It will also give you the ability to identify various strange objects you can find throughout the game, which can have unique effects. One of them is notorious for giving you extra XP, but is also pretty useless in the sense that it only affects a few of the side quests you'll get by the time you get it, and it's honestly more trouble than it's worth, in my opinion at least. Then we've got Haggle. That pretty much just reduces the cost of buying things and the amount you get when you sell it. And then Intimidate, Persuasion, and Seduction are all the ability to persuade people, if you will, via various methods. These show up in dialogue as being highlighted with different colors. Blue for persuasion, pink for seduction, that kind of thing. And this goes along with some of the disciplines that give you the dialogue options to do this stuff as well, like say Dominate. And then lastly, you've got Soak. Soak is your actual damage reduction. This is divided up into bashing, lethal, and aggravated. Or basically blunt, slashing or piercing, and then finally fire, electricity, claws, and fangs. Aggravated basically being stuff that is harder to heal. This shows up on your health bar as yellow damage, and while most regular damage heals fairly quickly on its own, aggravated damage takes longer and is usually better healed by actually feeding on someone. And that's kind of the bulk of what there is to know about progression. It's mostly just understanding what this stuff on the character page is and then actually utilizing it. There is a little bit of further progression via side things like some of those havens for certain clans that you can grab. There's also stuff like your clothing. What you start out with your basic outfit for a clan is not what you have to end the game with, but rather there are two vendors throughout the game that can upgrade both your actual look but also your clothes, which can give you better defenses. But with all of that said and done, let's finally move on to the story of this game. So I'm going to talk a lot about the story here, the things I enjoy about it, my takeaways from it, things like that. But understand, there might be some minor differences in terms of the clan you're playing, how an individual talks to you, and then based on, your actual skills that you have, there are situations where you might be able to talk your way through something, fight your way through it, the usual suspects, basically. Ultimately, though, the game kicks off where you, after having a wild night with a friend, let's say, ultimately gets embraced and turned into one of the kindred, a vampire. You are immediately busted in upon, staked in the heart, which only paralyzes vampires, and taken to a sort of vampire proceeding where the local prince, Sebastian Lacroix, executes the person who just turned you into a vampire because what they've done is illegal. Turning vampires without the permission of the Camarilla isn't something that is allowed, but right as you are about to be executed, someone from the crowd stands up to defend you. This is Nines Rodriguez, and in a moment of political expedience, Lacroix decides not to execute you, which is a nice little highlight about some of the political back and forth you're about to get stuck into. In saving your life, Lacroix basically says it wasn't done out of charity, and he expects something from you, so he tosses you out into the street with your main goal coming from Mercurio here in a bit. Now, to help you actually get your footing, we then have Smiling Jack, voiced by John DiMaggio, and all around just a fantastic character with a lot of fantastic opening lines. Either way, though, Smiling Jack's going to kind of get you up to speed on everything going on here via the tutorial, which is also going to teach you how to play. This is going to introduce concepts like actually typing passwords into the computers, as an example. How stealth works, or, doesn't work sometimes. And it's also going to introduce a lot of the major players. So basically what happened here, just to give you a little bit of background, the Camarilla very recently rolled back into the town as if they had never left, but they had. Some years ago, quite some time ago, the Anarchs, or the independent vampires if you will, pushed the Camarilla out of LA. They have since come back and are trying to put the place under their thumb again and act as if they are the ruling authority here, despite that just not being the case. They are at odds with the Anarchs, and while neither side really wants a costly war, as they are also fighting a third faction known as the Kuei Jin, there's a lot of tense back and forth here going on. Nines is the sort of de facto leader of the Anarchs, and so when he stuck up for you at this execution, it forced Lacroix's hand, and that's why he's giving you a mission that, to be frank, he probably doesn't expect you to survive. So after the tutorial, you find yourself in the Santa Monica Haven, or the Start, the main hub for the first area, and your little house inside of it. Now, your haven is effectively your apartment, and it's where you're going to go to check your emails. This is actually kind of important, and while there are some funny ones in here that are just for flavor, and some more, I would say, cryptic ones talking about events as if they were a chess game as the game proceeds, there's very clearly something bigger than you going on in all this, which you can kind of use something like the emails you can read at your haven to get a feel for things. But your first task is basically to go to a guy named Mercurio, who is a ghoul working for the Camarilla. A ghoul being a human that is fed vampire blood, forcing them to kind of do whatever the vampire wants as it creates a sort of blood bond. Mercurio explains the situation. You need to go get a bomb, use that bomb to blow up a warehouse. The only catch is the Astrolite, as it's called, is being held by a nearby group of thugs who was supposed to sell it to Mercurio, but instead beat him within an inch of his life, and he likely only survived thanks to the vampire blood. This makes your first task basically going and getting the Astrolite from these guys, and there's a variety of ways to do that. It's kind of your introduction to the play any way you want start of this game. However, I do want to mention here at the beginning, that is something that goes away as the game progresses. The first half of the game is really good about giving you a variety of options to get through certain situations. Unfortunately, and this is something that's been mentioned by developers and stuff in interviews since, the back half of the game, once you start getting into Hollywood and then especially Chinatown, they started leaning more and more towards combat specifically. And while it's not explicitly required in every situation, there are some cases where it becomes very apparent, and it can make things a problem. And you compare that to some of these early quests like this one where you have a variety of different options of getting in and out of here as an example, it definitely starts to show. But either way, your job via words or force is to go get the Astrolite from these thugs. Once you've got it, you return to Mercurio, who basically says you need to, of course, go blow up this warehouse now, but the catch is the only guy who could really help you get there is a guy named Bertram, a Nosferatu who hasn't been seen in a while because of a local feud between between two sisters who are the Barons of Santa Monica, that is to say the leading vampires here. One of them wants Bertram dead, and so he won't show up until you deal with this and get them to call off the hunt for the guy, more or less. This is going to lead you to Jeanette and Therese and their club, the Asylum. Now, Jeanette and Therese are, I would say, one of the more iconic characters of the game, not only for their look and the fact that they are on the cover art, but also for the big story twist that involves them. The first time I played through this, it did genuinely catch me off guard, but I did actually want to mention here the Malkavian, upon first meeting Jeanette, will actually immediately tell you this through their weird dialogue if you know what to look for, even if it is a little bit obscure. Now, I do want to stop right here, though, for a second and explain that I think this part of the game is probably where you'll have noticed what this game does really well, which is basically make short interactions with characters extraordinarily memorable. Like, by this point, you're likely have talked to Smiling Jack, who will have certainly made an impression, LaCroix, who was about to kill you and then sent you here. You may have potentially run into Heather or another guy who's really upbeat and happy, who's going to have some stuff to say to you later, as an example. And both through their lines and the actual delivery of those lines via the voice acting and everything, they managed to pack so much character into really short interactions that also at the same time feel like believable people at the time. And it's one of the things this game does the best. The character writing specifically is really, really good. But either way, Jeanette is going to tell you to go talk to Therese. Therese is Jeanette's sister. They do not get along. And Therese is going to send you on an errand, and if you do it, she'll call off the feud with Bertram. This is going to send you on one of, I think, the best quests this game has to offer, which is pretty early on, actually, and that is the Ocean Gate Hotel. So, your job here is to infiltrate a hotel, except it's haunted, and it is creepy as hell. I don't know how they managed to make this level, especially with graphics like this, feel so unnerving the first time you do it, but it's very memorable. And the fact that, you're the monster here, but they managed to make this place feel super creepy is impressive stuff. There's going to be ghosts, you're going to get things thrown at you constantly, and your goal is to basically find a locket here and bring it back to Therese. When you get back, though, Therese won't be there, and Jeanette will try to get the locket from you repeatedly before ultimately, regardless of whether or not you give it to her, giving you a separate task of going and slashing up a gallery that is getting a little too close overall to vampire society. This is where you're going to meet Guardsman Chunk, a character you're going to meet a lot over the course of the game, just an overweight security guard, basically, who's guarding the gallery. You have a variety of ways to get him out of your way before entering the gallery, and then you slash paintings in a certain order before sort of fighting this blood guardian thing. The only thing is, when you get back to Therese, you find out that the gallery was actually hers, and Jeanette has set you up here. This leads to an initial back and forth with Jeanette and Therese, where you have to go to, something like the diner as an example, but they set you up again, and you have to kill a bunch of thugs sent there to kill you, before ultimately being called back to the club to stop a fighting Therese and Jeanette. But this is where the big reveal comes that Therese and Jeanette aren't two different people. They are the same person, collectively referred to as Tourette. Tourette, again, I think is one of those things that is a fantastic initial introduction, and I definitely didn't see it coming the first time it happened. Now, over the course of this confrontation, you basically realize what happened, which is that this woman was abused by her father, which is almost certainly related to the identity disorder here, but either way, being of the Malkavian bloodline, the split personality has manifested in this way, and you have a few options here. You could have previously tried to seduce Jeanette if you wanted to and had the skills for it, but depending on the exact version of the game, the requirements change a little bit here, but if you have the appropriate stats, it is possible to talk these two down and basically force them to reconcile instead of one, killing the other one, which will, at the very least, affect the rest of their unlife. But once you get this situation sorted out, regardless of how it plays out, you're pretty much done here. That's when you're finally going to be given the location of Bertram, so you can get on with what you were sent here to do, which is blow up this warehouse. Bertram is a Nosferatu hanging out in an old sort of silo not all that far away in Santa Monica. You may have also run into his ghoul already, who has actually been following you around. Knox Harrington, who can give you another quest actually here to root out the Quay Gin in Santa Monica, but that's a separate thing. Bertram is basically going to guide you to the warehouse, and then this is your first big mission. Your goal is to make it into the office space to set the astrolight bomb that you've gotten previously. This is going to blow up the warehouse, but the catch is the warehouse belongs to the Sabbats, who will have previously attacked during the very beginning of the game as part of the tutorial, and the Sabbat, unlike the Camarilla, do not respect the Masquerade. They kind of wear their vampirism on their sleeves, so to speak. They make no real attempt to hide themselves from humans, and obviously they do not get along with the Camarilla pretty much at all. Now, after this is done, as you go to leave, you'll be met by a wolf that suddenly turns into a vampire himself, which is none other than Beckett. Beckett is basically going to ask if you've seen anything weird, or, anything weirder than everything else that's already happened, I suppose, as he is here investigating something. Beckett is a bit of a character in the lore, mind you, but he'll come up more later. Now, once you finally get back, you're done here, in Santa Monica, at least for the main story. Now you get to move on to downtown, because you have to report your success to none other than Sebastian LaCroix, who's immediately going to send you on a bunch of other missions. The first of which, after reporting your initial success, which, let's be honest, he was surprised you survived to begin with, being a fledgling vampire and all, he then sends you to meet with the Anarchs. On your way to downtown, you'll have met Nines already, who saved you at the big execution at the beginning, but also prevents some Sabbat from attacking you after you just blew up their warehouse on your way to downtown. When you get attacked by them, he saves your life again. But here you actually get to talk to him in part of the gameplay by meeting him at the last round. This is where you can also catch up with Smiling Jack and a couple of the other Anarchs, such as Damsel or Skelter, who will have various side quests for you. Now, this is where things get interesting, because I've pretty much introduced all the main factions at this point, and based on dialogue, you can more or less already side with one of them. It won't change too much in terms of the events of the game, like if you're basically all on board with like the Anarchs, for an example, they just tell you to keep working with Sebastian LaCroix so they can find out what he's after, with you being a sort of inside man. Whereas if you're working for Sebastian, then you're going to do what he says anyway by default. So via that little method, you can, again, more or less join with these different factions and work with them, but it doesn't like lock you off from doing anything. Not yet. Either way, once that introduction is done, Sebastian is going to send you to investigate the Elizabethan Dane. So this is a ship that, if you've been listening to the radio and stuff in-game, or even watching the TV in your haven, you'll likely have heard about already. There is effectively a ghost ship off the coast of LA that showed up with basically nobody on it, everyone having been murdered, blood everywhere, that kind of thing, but also a very odd sarcophagus that was aboard the ship that has caught the attention of all of the local vampires who basically want to know what the sarcophagus is, with the fear that it may contain a antediluvian, or essentially an extremely old vampire with a nonsense amount of power who could potentially start Vampire Armageddon, known as Gehenna. Your job is basically to go scout all of that out, without killing anyone, ideally, so they don't have any Masquerade violations or answers to clean up on their end, and, functionally speaking, you get some more XP and everything, but your goal is to go investigate this ship and then report back to LaCroix. It's a very short mission, especially if you actually follow the instructions. Takes less than a couple of minutes. And once you get back, you'll meet Sebastian talking to a bunch of other vampires. These guys are known as the Primogen. You may or may not have met one of them, Strauss, already, especially if you were a Tremere, as he gives you a quest via a card in your Santa Monica haven to come find him at the Chantry of the Tremere in the downtown area, which you are free to explore as soon as you arrive. Strauss and the other Primogen, though, have come to Sebastian with a problem. The Malkavian Primogen, Grout, or Alistair Grout, is missing. No one's heard from him. The Primogen, by the way, if you don't know, are basically the clan elders for the city that answer to the prince for the Camarilla. Your job is to go investigate his house, see what's going on there, and this is another really, really fun level. But when you arrive, you find none other than Nines there, acting very strangely before leaving. When you enter, you find out that Grout's house basically also doubles as an insane asylum, where you're going to have to fight off some local crazies, as well as make your way through a variety of puzzles before finally getting to Grout, only to find out that while he has, notoriously, a lot more rational thoughts than most most Malkavians, he's still very clearly not doing well. In fact, he's preserved his wife, who clearly was dying of some illness that he was trying to solve futilely. He's also doing investigations into the root causes of vampirism and how he might cure that as well. But one could say that his demontation of his Malkavian blood is just the ability to think these things are even possible, but he's also haunted by voices that seem to imply that he should not trust Sebastian LaCroix. Either way, though, once you get to his bedroom, you find a bunch of ashes and a skeleton chained down, and it would appear Alistair is dead. But upon your exit, basically, you run into a human being, a vampire hunter, none other than Grunfield Buck. He was here to kill Alistair, but it appears that has already been done, and he's very confused about you not having been here to do that yourself. So after some back and forth, you basically escape once he sets the place on fire, which is probably for the best given the contents of the house and everything. This is clearly a Masquerade violation. But either way, once all that's done, you can go report everything back to Sebastian again. Now, from here, things start to get interesting again because LaCroix is actually going to send you to the Museum of Natural History, where the sarcophagus that was on the ship has been transferred to, basically so you can collect it for him. This is another fun little mission. Honestly, stealth goes a long way here. You get some extra experience for not killing anybody along the way. But once you get to where the sarcophagus is being held, you find out that it's not here. Somebody already stole it. Beckett will actually catch up to you. You can have some conversations with him to get a lot of information that I've already told you about Gehenna and the vampires and everything, as he's something of a vampire archaeologist, and you can even get a stat boost for having done so, which is always fun. But Beckett doesn't know where the thing is any more than you do, but he starts talking to LaCroix about it once you guys leave here, and LaCroix has essentially one thought, and that is that the Nosferatu were the only people who told him where this thing was, and the only person who knew about it besides him, so it's extremely likely that they are involved in its disappearance somehow, and he sends you to go find them in Hollywood, which brings us to our third hub area. Now, I do want to stress again, this is where the quality of things takes a bit of a harsh dip. Things start to take a pretty big turn here towards a more combat-oriented focus, and where you had a lot of options to get through quests previously, this is where it starts to pigeonhole you down like one route a lot of the time. And while stealth is technically possible in many of them, a lot of things here will end in a fight one way or another. But once you go to Hollywood, via the trusty taxi you'll have always taken to get here, you'll pretty much immediately be accosted by an individual working for the local baron, Isaac Abrams. Isaac is theoretically the person you would ask about where the Nosferatu are, but in classic vampire fashion, he's not going to help you until you've helped him, of course, which involves, in this case, tracking down this strange tape everyone's been talking about that supposedly shows something disturbing, and yet nobody will talk about it or do anything for you, basically. So you have to go try to track down the person who was supposed to show up and give it to Isaac so he could figure out what was going on with it. After meeting the guy and eventually getting the first part of the tape, he is apparently immediately murdered as he runs around the corner, but then you bring that tape back to Isaac, who plays it, and it shows these disturbing monsters murdering a woman, but it's also clear that it's not the whole tape. They've only got about half of it, but thanks to a logo at the end of the tape, that gives you another lead to start tracking down the rest of it, which leads you to a local smut shop, basically, which is another one of the more interesting characters, let's say, in the game that you can talk to, the guy who owns the Sin Bin, as it's called. He's going to point you to the production company that made the thing, but once you get there and get in, you find those strange creatures in here destroying everything already, but you'll eventually get the rest of the tape to bring back to Isaac. Isaac recognizes the house where all of the disturbing imagery is coming from, and he tells you where to go find it, and your job is obviously to get to the bottom of this, so hopefully he'll tell you about the Nosferatu, or at least help you find them, as it's pretty clear they've disappeared at this point. Well, once you get to the house, sure enough, you find out that this is the place with the strange fleshy abominations, and when you get to the basement, you are met by none other than, I believe his actual name's Andre, but they just call him by his clan name in-game, which is the Tumultuous. These are one of the clans that are not playable in the game, but, or at least by default anyway, are still really cool. They are basically masters of flesh sculpting, and can even warp and change their own appearance and the like, which is what leads to, everything you've seen up in this point to what they like to do with their domains. Their goal is to twist and mutilate flesh, but in particular what's actually going on here is that the Sabbat, the sect of vampires to which the tumultuous belong, are also looking for the Nosferatu, and Andre here is making all of these fleshy creatures to flood the sewers with them where the Nosferatu live to try to track them down, so he can also get his hands on the sarcophagus, for different reasons, of course, than LaCroix. Which then leads us to the most notorious part of this game, probably, which is none other than the Nosferatu Warrens. The Nosferatu Warrens are a very large dungeon filled with a lot of repeated monsters that basically nobody really enjoys doing, but I will say it is one of those things that can be a little bit on the exaggerated side because the Warrens aren't that bad once you've played through it one time. The first time you go down there, you'll probably be hurting pretty bad, especially if you're playing as like a Ventru, because most of your blood source down here is going to be from the rats that are running around, and basically if you haven't been building a combat character up to this point, you're going to feel it really bad here. Some versions of the Plus patch actually include the option to skip the Nosferatu Warrens altogether. That's how much people dislike it, but once you know where to go and what the puzzles and stuff are, it's honestly not as bad as people make it out to be. But one of the real big issues is that it all looks very similar to each other, and they like to repeat bosses here. So they introduced this sort of weird fleshy spider boss thing, which is fine. I think this is kind of the appropriate place to have another boss fight, but immediately after you fight this thing, you're going to be making your way through the rest of the Warrens where this boss repeats like 5 or 6 times. And it doesn't make a lot of sense. Now, depending on your clan, you may or may not have an easier time down here. For instance, a well-built Tremere can just blood boil most of these guys to death instantly, as an example. Nosferatu, they can feed on the rats down here so they're not hurting for blood, and with their potence ability, they should be totally fine, as an example. But basically, a lot of people don't like the Warrens for good reason, because it's not a very good dungeon. And while it's not as bad as people make it out to be, it certainly ain't good either. Either way though, at the very end of that quite long dungeon, you're going to find yourself in the actual Nosferatu Warrens, where the Nosferatu have been hiding. This includes Amalia, Mitnick, and the leader, the primogen for the Nosferatu, Gary Golden, an old actor, as is the case with most of these Nosferatu, who have been cruelly transformed into hideous beasts as a cruel twist of fate, and if you are playing as a Toreador, these guys hate your guts. Because Toreador are, classically very attractive, and the Nosferatu are like the exact opposite. And also, again, most of these guys used to be really beautiful people in life, often actors and actresses that have been, for hilarity's sake in some cases, turned into ugly vampires. Either way, though, once you talk to Gary, who is surprisingly charismatic for a Nosferatu, after a bit of a creepy introduction, he basically tells you that yes, he does know where the sarcophagus is, as is the kind of running theme here, but he's not going to help you until you help him. And in particular, one of his Nosferatu minions has gone missing. In fact, he went missing around Chinatown, which brings us to our game's 4th hub. The Chinatown hub is very, very small, and your main goal here is to basically find the guy that is missing from the Nosferatu. Chinatown is run by the Kuei Jin, which you may or may not have run into previously up to this point, depending on whether or not you did a quest and Santa Monica in particular. But the Kuei Jin are Eastern vampires. They function a bit differently, and they frankly look down on regular vampires. They are, simply put, not your friends, and, probably shouldn't be trusted, but we'll circle back to that later. Ming Zhao, on the other hand, is going to give you the leads you need to do what you need to do here and, get out, basically. She points you to a guy at the Red Dragon restaurant down the way, but it turns out that his daughter's been kidnapped, and if you help him find his daughter, he'll tell you what he knows about your friend's disappearance. He points you to another guy named Zhao, who tells you who very likely kidnapped the missing Nosferatu, and this puts you into the sort of local nightclub area where your job is to take out the local Tong leader, as they call him. But the catch is, this guy was in contact with some creepy guy called the Mandarin on a screen. The Mandarin supposedly has your friend and wants you to come down to a building called the Fu Syndicate, clearly luring you into a trap of some sort. However, the Fu Syndicate, I think, actually turns into one of the cooler quests of the game, because what's happening here is that the Mandarin has been tasked with tracking down vampires, basically, and trying to figure out how to kill them, having identified that they exist exist to begin with. And so he puts you through a series of trials, subjecting you to lights which don't do anything, removing all the air from a room, which of course doesn't kill you. And eventually you'll get to a fire room where you can blow up a tank, which breaks a window, which then of course lets you go on a complete killing spree to all the people who are just performing these tests on you. And of course clearing up any Masquerade violations along the way, I would imagine. But you're also going to find the missing Nosferatu down here that they were doing tests on as well. And with his help, you're going to escape the area, which is where you'll get a phone call from Gary Golden, who will finally, after all that trouble, reveal the location of the sarcophagus and where it was absconded to. None other than the hands of the Giovanni estate. The Giovanni being a kind of old bloodline that is into some truly deplorable things in order to maintain their gift of vampirism. But luckily, this is another really cool quest and has a variety of ways you can actually go about doing it, because you can attack just straight up, you can sneak through the place and not engage with some of the main things, but once you get there, you can either break in or get an invitation. Right out front, there's a very memorable interaction between a guy and his wife, with the wife being particularly drunk and in no state to present herself to the Giovanni family. And if you have the persuasion check to send them home and give you their invitation, she just pukes a bunch of blood. And his lack of concern, and rather his complete disdain for this woman, is especially notable, just as a memorable bit of dialogue. But once you actually get inside, things are a little different. You have, again, a couple options. You can convince a woman, if you have high enough persuasion, to just show you to the basement of the place, which is where you actually need to go, bypassing all of it. But otherwise, you can pit three hopefuls this year against each other, trading secrets. You can learn about them through your stats and humanity and stuff, selling them out to the other Giovanni members before everything kind of goes sideways and you get into the basement anyway. But one way or another, your goal is to get into the basement of this place. But this is where things get especially interesting, because the people actually guarding the sarcophagus itself is none other than the Chang brothers, as they're known, who are Kuei Jin. They are working directly for Ming Zhao, and they mention very directly a agreement that is apparently in place between the Kuei Jin and the Camarilla, specifically Sebastian Lacroix, which is certainly news to you, given that, they're supposed to be at odds with each other and not getting along at all. And especially if you've already learned a little bit about the Kuei Jin, this is suspicious at best. Either way, though, they're going to attack and try to kill you, which serves as a boss fight, and then once you've got these guys taken down, you successfully retrieve the sarcophagus and bring it back to Sebastian Lacroix and Beckett. They're going to explain that to open it, you're probably going to need a key, and the only person who would likely know who that is the archaeologist that was working on it once it was transferred to the museum. And the thing is, he's been taken from a local hotel recently by the Society of Leopold, the vampire hunters that you ran into earlier. Which means our next mission is a rescue mission for the archaeologist here, which involves either sneaking or fighting your way through an enormous amount of vampire hunters, and these guys are actually pretty dangerous as well. It is, again, possible to sneak past these guys, albeit a bit difficult. Either way, though, you're in for a memorable fight, because regardless of what you did, you've got a boss fight coming in the form of none other than Grunfield Bach, the vampire hunter you met all the way back at Alistair Grout's mansion. Once you've successfully defeated him, you can pick up the archaeologist, who has an interesting bit of voice acting, and he's of course going to tell you everything there is to know about the sarcophagus. But first you have to get him out of here, because Grunfield activates some sort of self-destruct thing, and you have about a minute to get from where you are to the boat that'll take you out of this particular area, and of course back to Sebastian Lacroix and Beckett. While you are gone, Lacroix has been attacked by the Sabbat. Your job is to finish wiping out their leader, Andre, who you will have fought earlier, but who managed to survive somehow, has holed up in the Hallowbrook Hotel. Now what's interesting is that if you're in the basic version of the game and you've turned Heather into a ghoul, which we'll talk about here in a bit, she dies right here. If you have the plus patch, however, you could have told her to stay inside and avoid that fate, as a lot of people like to do, because, having a ghoul is kind of a unique thing in this game, and you only get the one. But honestly, pretty long dungeon full of, honestly, a lot of easier to kill enemies, a lot of available blood sources via the Sabbat ghouls that you can take out, so it's honestly not very hard if you've been leveling up to this point, which I sure hope you have. But as you exit the Hallowbrook Hotel is where things get really interesting, because you run into none other than Ming Zhao, who explains that there in fact was an agreement of sorts between the Kuei Jin and the Camarilla. In fact, she took on the the appearance of Nines, who you ran into at Alistair Grout's mansion, to frame Nines for the death of Alistair Grout, which I didn't mention a little bit because I kind of wanted to explain it here. But basically, after you met Nines there, Sebastian Lacroix called a blood hunt on Nines for the death of Alistair Grout, basically blaming the Anarchs for the whole thing so he could take out their leader and, leave them rudderless. Except here you find out that that was actually Ming Zhao who did that, and that obviously she's working with Lacroix, and that very obviously Lacroix cannot be trusted, and he has betrayed Ming Zhao at this point as well. So, in order to get rid of Alistair Grout, who was getting a little too close to Lacroix's secrets for his own comfort, he kind of spun this whole thing into his favor, except now it's starting to come undone because you have hard proof that there was an alliance between the Kuei Jin and Lacroix, which is not something everyone else would accept, basically. And once you go back to Lacroix, you can reveal this treachery, which means that the blood hunt that was called upon Nines has been called off, and your job is to go find the guy. And after talking to the Anarchs, you find out the holdup in Griffith Park. Unfortunately, once you get there, and you explain to Nines everything that's been going on, somebody sets fire to the nearby forest, which upsets the local werewolves. That's why Nines hid here in the first place. The true werewolves that actually inhabit this place are monstrous entities that can easily tear apart a single vampire. It's not even close. At this point, Nines gets attacked by a werewolf and flung off the side of the area you're on near the observatory, and you are left one-on-one with another werewolf with the job basically of being to wait out a timer for the next lift to get up here so you can escape. Now, if you know what you're doing, it is actually possible to kill the werewolf here via turning on the power and then using the doors of the observatory to trap the thing. Takes a little bit of doing, but it can be done, and honestly I like doing it because it's a little faster than waiting out the timer, truth be told. But either way, once that's done, you can head back to the bottom of the park only to meet Smiling Jack, who has let you know about yet another betrayal. You see, while you were gone, Sebastian Lacroix rescinded Nines' blood hunt, yes, but he actually put one out on you this time. You have discovered his alliance with the Kuei Jin, which means he also needs you dead now, and your job, via Smiling Jack, is to escape at this point. You do this by initially heading back to your Santa Monica haven to get back on your feet real quick, but then you have to fight through the streets of Santa Monica to make it to the cab driver that's been ferrying you around everywhere. And this is where the end sequence of the story begins. Based on the choices you make in this cab conversation, alongside some choices you can make here in just a moment, or choices you had made previously in the case of the Kuei Jin, you have some options to how you would like to end the game. Basically choosing from one of the available endings to you. It's also very telling that the cab driver here very, very obviously knows all about kindred and vampire society, but we'll get to that in a minute. So basically, in this conversation with the cab driver, you can express what you would like to do. Do you want to side with the Camarilla, the Anarchs? Do you want to go your own independent route? And all of those choices lead to different endings, although some of them are relatively similar. Now, most of the endings are available kind of regardless, with the exception being the Kuei Jin. There is an option to side with the Kuei Jin, but in order to do that, you need to have been very polite to Ming Zhao along the way, and that is in the face of her constantly putting regular vampires down, some information you can find about what they've been doing and spying on people for, and honestly the fact that it's very obvious they are not trustworthy in general. And all told, depending on how you want to count it, there's between 5 to 7 endings. Let's start with Sebastian, though. So let's say you want to go with the Camarilla still, and you think you can convince Lacroix to trust you as he goes to open the sarcophagus finally. Well, you can do that. You can go to Lacroix, basically say, hey man, we're good, let's just get the sarcophagus open. Basically get him to side with you again, and then he sends you to where the Kuei Jin are, because it was revealed to you by Ming Zhao earlier that she has the key to the sarcophagus. In order to open it, you're going to need that. So after, moving through yet another dungeon in Chinatown, you'll eventually, after a series of puzzles that are honestly kind of annoying, confront the leader of the Kuei Jin, Ming Zhao, as one of the final bosses. Honestly, worst boss in the game by far and away. She has a gigantic health pool. Even with the plus patch, it's really annoying. Especially if you're using bladed weapons, you can cut off the tentacles of the thing she turns into, which can spawn into more versions of the monster she already is, and she will regrow those tentacles, so it can just keep happening. And if you are not spec'd out for combat, you are going to feel it hard here. This is the worst boss in the game. It is not balanced. Some disciplines are better at it than others, though. Like, for instance, the Tremere Blood Boil ability is extraordinarily strong here and can be extremely useful. But eventually, she will die, and you can grab the key from her and then take that back to Sebastian. At this point, if you've sided with Sebastian, you have no other choice but to open the sarcophagus with him, find out it's full of C4 that was apparently planted there by Jack, and then you blow up and die, and that's your ending. Congratulations. There is an sort of after-credit scene here, though, where it shows Jack, the cab driver, and the mummy that was apparently in the tomb kind of having a laugh about the whole situation. We'll talk again more about the cab driver in a moment. Now, your second option for the Camarilla is slightly different. You can basically side with the Camarilla, but rather replace the person in charge, this time with Maximilian Strauss, which I don't remember if there is a specific trigger involving a quest or if you can always do it. There is a quest you have to do for Strauss, but I don't remember that necessarily being a prerequisite to this. Either way, though, if through the conversation with the cab driver you say that you want to side with the Camarilla, but you don't want to leave LaCroix in charge, your option is Maximilian Strauss, which makes an extreme amount of sense for a Tremere character, as that's kind of who you'll have been likely working with to some degree throughout the game anyway. At least more than other clans, mind you. In this ending, you have to go get the key from the Kuei Jin again, but you also have to then fight your way up the tower that belongs to LaCroix, where you will fight his sheriff at the end of it, as every prince has a sheriff, and you'll have seen this guy in the opening, as well as if you break all of your masquerades, he shows up to kill you. And by shows up, I mean instantly kills you. But here, he is a boss fight as a normal kind of guy with a sword at first, but then after that, he actually whips out his gigantic bat form and fights you in the sky, which means if you are lacking for ranged options, you got to use lights to bring him down out of the sky and knock him down, so you can hit him in melee before, of course, taking the fight to Sebastian. You don't actually fight Sebastian, that is done via cutscene, but in this instance, the sarcophagus is not opened, and Strauss actually has it put away in storage, and you don't see that extra scene with the cab driver and everything, and it's implied that you become a ranking member of the Camarilla here in LA. But we're not done yet, so let's assume for some reason you wanted to side with the Kuei Jin, even though it is very obviously a bad idea. I actually didn't have footage of this one, but it's kind of underwhelming anyway. Instead of fighting the Kuei Jin, you go straight to the tower, do the same events I just talked about, but this time the Kuei Jin take the sarcophagus, chain you to it, and dump it in the Pacific Ocean so it can't be opened. You are not directly killed per se, as you're a vampire. You can not exactly breathe underwater, but you don't need to breathe underwater. But an underwhelming ending you get from trusting yet another person you should not have trusted. Which leaves us with the Anarchs and the Independent ending. These two are a little different depending on exactly what you do. So in this instance, we yet again have to fight the Kuei Jin for the key, go to the tower, get to the top of it so we can have our showdown with Sebastian LaCroix. At this point, you'll have a choice of what to do, and you can either open the sarcophagus or leave it be. If you open it, you blow up and die, just like before. If you choose not to, you leave the tower, and then, depending on if you sided with the Anarchs or chose to go independent, you either, of course, side with them, or you walk away while flipping them off. Now, there is one more ending, I want to get to that in just a second, but depending on who you sided with and how things turned out here, it basically comes down to this. If you left the Camarilla in control via either LaCroix or Strauss, it's a little hesitant. So if LaCroix died, obviously, he could theoretically be replaced, but the Camarilla will have been dealt a blow. If you remove LaCroix and put Strauss in place, you presumably also stuck around to help with the Camarilla, and it's likely then that the Anarchs overall lost this confrontation and the Camarilla retakes LA, albeit with some effort. The other side of this, however, if you side with the Anarchs, is that the Camarilla is largely forced out. They had a tenuous grasp on the place to begin with. They clearly don't have a lot of forces to send here to do anything, and at least for the time being, until an inevitable second challenger shows up, or perhaps the Camarilla again, the Anarchs have bought some time of their own sort of independent faction here. And then, of course, Kuei Jin is a bit different altogether. It's hard to gauge their strength or their overall presence in the area, but, obviously not good, I suppose. Then there is the final ending, the Easter egg ending. This is added in by the Plus patch. I believe there were file remnants for it in the original game, if I am remembering correctly, and the most prominent version of it is when the Malkavian does it, because they get some special dialogue for this. But basically, it's an Easter egg where you can make a giant werewolf dance after LaCroix turns into one. So this is triggered by by going to the Lucky Star Motel in Hollywood and really quickly opening and closing one of the doors there until a giant werewolf shows up. And once you've seen that werewolf, you've unlocked this ending. Anybody can choose it, provided you don't side with like LaCroix or Strauss, which prevents you from having a conversation with LaCroix at the end, which is where you have to pick the dialogue option for this to happen. But basically, you need the chance to pick the dialogue option, which mentions something about having seen the Easter egg werewolf, which then causes Sebastian to turn into a werewolf. More of a joke than an ending, but still worth talking about. But you may have realized that I talked a little bit about the cab driver in both of those. So the cab driver, just to not bury the lead here, is thought to be Cain, the father of all vampires. In fact, I think it's not technically canon if you want to get like down into it, but the game files even refer to the cab driver as Cain. If you use the Auspex discipline, it's very clear he is not mortal, at the very least. And the idea seems to be that he set all of this up for some unknown reason. So there is that little bit of information for you, but that is pretty much the entirety of the main story of Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines. And yet we are far from done. We have a whole host of other things to talk about, because the main story of this game is maybe 10 to 15 hours if you were just beelining it, but I think much of what makes this game so great is actually everything that happens on the side. All of the gameplay elements and the world elements from experiencing all of that stuff yourself. So let's talk a little bit about that. As I've kind of already alluded to, the game is divided up into hubs and levels, the four main hubs being Santa Monica, Downtown, Hollywood, and Chinatown. There are individual levels you can travel back and forth to. I don't remember if the plus patch is what allows that or not, but places like the Museum Kingsway, where the Tamitsi guy is, the Giovanni Estate, you can typically travel back to those after the fact, which is useful for picking up some quest items as an example. So the hubs and those levels, basically. You're going to fast travel between almost all of those with the taxi driver, or Cain as it turns out, and each of those hubs acts as an area that you have to be mindful of. So there are essentially 3 zone categories in this game. Elysium, no powers or weapons allowed, as this is the haven of a powerful vampire that prevents these things. A masquerade area, where you have to be careful about using your powers in front of humans. Some are okay, some are not. And then finally, combat zones, where pretty much everything is good to go. Now, in order to navigate these zones, you have to do things like feed, so you don't frenzy and turn into the beast, which is an automatic masquerade violation if anybody sees it. And you also have to avoid using your powers in front of humans and things ideally as well to, again, avoid masquerade violations. You get enough of those, the sheriff shows up to kill you. Now, when you're feeding on various characters, depending on your clan, exactly who you want to feed on will change, though be careful in Downtown. Some of the homeless people there are diseased and can hurt you more than they will heal you when you feed on them. But basically, there are some rules to it. But there's also a lot of opportunities for different types of feeding. For instance, every area typically has a club, and there's almost always a human there you can talk to, and with the appropriate skills, you can convince that person that, let's say you're looking for a date, and this actually gives you an opportunity to feed in public with everybody around because of the nature of it. That's a really convenient way to get your blood points up. Your blood points, or that big bar to the right you'll surely have seen on screen by now, is basically your blood pool, the amount of blood you currently have in you, and you are going to use that to either heal yourself via blood heal or buff yourself via blood buff, which everyone gets, and then of course activate all your various powers. In between all this running around, you can head back up to your haven to do things like check your emails or check on your ghoul, which is another convenient way to get blood, by the way. But where this really shines is utilizing your stats and everything to perform the various skill checks required of you, because it's important to remember that some dialogue choices are only available if you've heard about those things previously, like for instance Heather the Ghoul. Right away in Santa Monica, if you know what you're doing, you can acquire a ghoul, a human that you fed your blood who will then help you out by basically serving you. In order to do that, after finding Heather injured in the hospital there, though, you have to first learn about what a ghoul is, which you can learn by talking to Mercurio or Knox Harrington about it, as they are both ghouls. So stuff like that, on top of simply having the stats for the dialogue option to show up to begin with, is a really fun way to play around with different ways to complete a different quest. Oftentimes, outside of, the later combat-focused missions towards the end of the game, there are typically a lot of variety of ways to get to what you want without necessarily directly engaging with combat. And I think that's why clans like the Toreador, as an example, really shine towards the beginning of the game before that combat switch happens. Basically, it's a game that responds really, really well to your choices, and that's what I think so many people love so much about it. From here, though, I actually wanted to kind of break down the interesting quests and interactions based on each hub. So in Santa Monica, in your search for the Astrolite at the beginning of the game, you are going to run into some Thin Bloods. Thin Bloods are basically vampires so far removed from Cain that they no longer have the necessary power in their blood to really be a full-fledged vampire. Their existence is a sign of the oncoming Gehenna or vampire apocalypse, and as such they are shunned and often outright killed. There's a bunch of these guys hanging out on the beach, and you can do some quests for them involving one of them being tied up in the local blood bank, which is how they are getting vampire blood to sell to people, which is kind of a dark quest. That one's a lot of fun. You can meet Arthur Kilpatrick, the bounty hunter in Santa Monica as well. He puts you onto a really fun quest where you have to get to the bottom of a prosthetics shop that is apparently abducting people and doing who knows what to make prosthetics. You can get a severed arm from that quest, which you can then use as a weapon, which is really funny. That is definitely one of the more memorable quests this game has. And then, of course, there's Heather the Ghoul I already told you about. Now, moving it on to downtown a little bit, we've talked a fair bit about Strauss and everything he does in terms of the game's story and everything. He has his hub here. The Anarchs, of course, have their hub here. This is where you can talk to Damsel and Skelter, but Strauss, or Damsel, depending on who you talk to, will put you onto a quest here to track down a plague bearer. You see, disease means nothing to vampires, but they can still incubate and spread it, even if it doesn't affect them. Some vampires, called plague bearers, take a certain joy in this, but it brings unwanted attention, frankly, and so the Anarchs or Strauss would like you to get to the bottom of this. These are really fun interactions where you have to actually fight other vampires by tracking them down, and in fact, probably one of the more initially difficult fights you'll get into is with the very last plague bearer you have to fight, a guy named Bishop something or another, who has a celerity and a shotgun, and can be pretty annoying to fight early on. In fact, this time around, I only beat him because I wound up frenzying, which gives you a big buff to your physical attacks, and that just kind of was exactly what I needed in this particular case. There are a couple of other cool things in downtown, though. For starters, you can investigate an old abandoned hospital, which has a film crew there trying to do like a film the supernatural type thing, but they are being massacred, and when you get to the bottom of the place, it turns out to be Pisha. I really love Pisha's inclusion in Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines because she is representative of different vampire bloodlines. So outside of the main clans, there are also other, let's say, more exotic brands of vampire. And what Pisha is something called a Nagaraja. And simply put, in addition to the blood, they actually have to eat flesh along with it. So they don't just drink blood, they just straight up eat the flesh of the person that they are feeding upon. She sends you on some interesting quests to gather some artifacts from the museum and the Giovanni estate. She'll give you some artifacts in return that are really helpful, like the Odious Chalice, which acts as a refillable blood bag, more or less. Also downtown, if you have the plus patch only, you can fight a boss of the La Sombra clan, one of my personal favorite clans. You'll have seen this guy following you around up to the point where you fight him. And this was meant to be an extra Sabbat boss, but was cut from the original. The plus patch returns it, and you can track that guy down. Now, in Hollywood, we have some especially memorable quests, albeit kind of frustrating at times. So starting with Velvet Velour. In the Hollywood Strip area, you can go into what is effectively a strip club and meet the kindred Velvet Velour. And I want to take this moment to mention that this is where the game doubles up on something that, to be honest with you, I find a little bit annoying. So it is stated multiple times that vampires do not have sex drives. Everything they do in that regard is specifically to tempt humans, which makes sense. They're like predators in the literal sense of the word. They're trying to lure you in and trap you. However, both Jeanette and Velvet Velour here are doing this thing where they're appealing to you, the player, rather than to you, the character. They are very much using their sex appeal to try to convince you to do certain things, except they're not speaking to your character when they're doing this. They're speaking to you, the person playing the game. And I think it's one of the rare moments in this game where it's kind of a bit of a miss in terms of how they are kind of like speaking to you. And I get that I guess you're supposed to be a fledgling and maybe more susceptible to this kind of the thing, but it feels a little hand-wavy to explain it that way because they keep trying to tempt you with like sexual appeal when that very clearly should not be an effective motivator. And Velvet is, again, where they do it twice, which is annoying, honestly. Velvet nonetheless sends you on some fantastic quests. First, to kill a vampire hunter who is also acting as a stripper. Over at the Sin Bin, you have to clear out the customers and then ideally kill her all by her lonesome so that she will not be tracking down Velvet anymore. This is followed up by a quest where a writer at the Lucky Star Motel is actually writing effectively a novel on what is going to be exactly what Kindred Society is, which needs to be put a stop to for the sake of the Masquerade, of course. There's a bunch of different ways to handle that, and then depending on how you deal with them, Velvet may or may not like you towards the end of it. Another one here is the infamous Graveyard quest. So as part of the storyline here, you'll go to the Graveyard. The Graveyard, however, is being guarded by I believe he's supposed to be a ghoul here, Romero. Romero is keeping all of the zombies at the graveyard in check. He wants you to watch the graveyard and kill any zombies that pop up while he goes and gets some beer. Fair enough, I suppose. Now, in so doing, however, you've unknowingly probably stepped into one of the more difficult quests to actually pass, because basically you have to guard the gates of the graveyard, which are at two opposite ends, from an enormous amount of zombies that pop up. Depending on your clan, this is very, very difficult. There is, however, still to this day an easy cheese strategy that still works, so you can just go to a far part of the cemetery here, and it just completely stops the zombies from spawning, which means you win by default. Rough quest, though. One of my favorite quests personally in the game, actually, is that after you deal with everything else, Isaac Abrams, the Baron of Hollywood, will ask you to investigate a gargoyle that has taken residence in the Asian theater here. You can either just go run straight in and kill the thing, or if you picked up a book in Strauss's Chantry earlier, you can learn that gargoyles are the creation of the Tremere, and you can talk to him about it. If you do this, he'll actually give you a talisman that reduces the damage you would take from the gargoyle, which makes it easier. And he also asks you not to tell Isaac about the fact that the Tremere are the people who make these things. Now, if you are a Tremere, you can actually use this opportunity to be formally invited into the pyramid of the clan Tremere, which because of the way you were sired, you were not in previously, which then gives you access to the Chantry Haven, which comes with another relic that makes the Tremere powers crazy strong. It's also possible to persuade the gargoyle to stop attacking everything, but there's a lot of ways that quest can play out, whether or not you do or don't tell Isaac about things, that kind of stuff. Very fun quest. On top of that, once you've actually found the Nosferatu, you can go down into the sewers and do some quests for them, which are mostly more stealth-based, setting up cameras. Nosferatu are notoriously in love with their security networks and the tech side of things, as they've, of course, got a face made for radio. But then finally, there's Chinatown. Chinatown is very small and does not have nearly as much content in comparison to the other places. This is very noticeable, as there's only I think 5 side quests there. One is going back and forth between 2 retired hitmen and either getting an increased price to kill one of them, or convincing them to forgive each other and just split the cash of the reward they're trying to offer you for doing so. There's another one that you basically just go collect some stuff for one of the strange merchants here, and he'll give you some artifacts that are really useful in return. Honestly, the reward does not fit the effort there. You get a crazy reward for not a lot of effort. And then finally, the Hinge Yokai. You can find a young, very anime woman here who is a demon hunter of sorts who wants to track down this sort of shark demon that you can find in Chinatown. And if you help her do exactly that, and she actually lives, she'll help you out with the Kuei Jin at the very end of the game in return. But that's kind of the bulk of what you're looking at in terms of the gameplay and everything. It's mostly just finding unique and fun ways to utilize your clan's powers as you navigate all of these different quests and interesting encounters, which can lead to a variety of outcomes based on both your powers as well as your skills and everything to sort of acclimate to any given situation. And when a game is asking you to make moral choices, like is it right for a nightclub owner to ask for you to kill the person who gave her the loan because that person is part of the Russian mob and has been exploiting this woman when she can't pay? Or do you want to side with the Russian mob? Because obviously that nightclub owner's just straight up out here resorting to murder, but also you're a vampire, so where's your moral line in the sand in that situation, I guess, is what I'm trying to ask. And I think Vampire the Masquerade does such a tremendous job of asking questions like that in a really interesting way that is also very representative of the time in which this game is made. To put it simply, you just really don't see games like this anymore, and I don't think you really can because the time in which it was made influenced so much of what it was. I think even if you took this exact same team and asked them to make a game again, it would be a very different experience because we're no longer in that time. And in that way, looking at Vampire the Masquerade, even with the patches and stuff, is almost like looking into this weird time capsule of pop culture and society in a way that I just don't think any other game quite captures in this specific way, which is why I think I love this game as much as I do. But In spite of everything I've just mentioned and how great it is, there is one glaring problem with this game, and that is combat in all of its forms, while occasionally has its cool moments via disciplines and stuff, is also kind of terrible. Combat in this game is its biggest weak point by far. I'm not saying it's not enjoyable, mind you. I do think, personally, running around as a Tremere and blood boiling all of your enemies is really funny. To pretend that it's not a janky, weird mess of an experience in that regard is just lying to yourself. Now, all of it is stats-based, of course, down to the disciplines you have available to you, but also your effectiveness with the type of combat you are trying to engage in, but ultimately it comes down to stealth, guns, unarmed, melee, or your disciplines. Stealth is a little busted. It is, as I mentioned, either terrible or you could be right in front of somebody without them seeing you. There are a lot of situations where stealth is not super advantageous because, you're just in a boss fight and things will see you and there's no way around that, so I would not expect to stealth your way through everything, but it can be very useful in certain situations, definitely. Although the game is a little hit or miss about actually giving you the icon to stealth kill an enemy, so even then, a fair bit of jank. Guns tend to be a little underwhelming. You can lean fully into guns, and at the max ranks, they are much more accurate and they deal much more damage, which is obviously super helpful, but even the best ones are not as consistent, let's say, as the various forms of melee combat, be that with actual weapons or even the unarmed attacks. Now, the problem with unarmed is that it's really good in the beginning of the game, but it falls off towards the end. By the end of the game, depending on exactly what enemies you're fighting, it takes a long time to kill things, typically because they have really good soak, as an example, and because of that, unless you are combining unarmed also with potence discipline, which you may or may not have, depending on your clan, I honestly wouldn't suggest it. But if you can combine it with potence, it tends to be pretty good. Melee is very consistent, but the problem is you can't really block or anything, so you're constantly getting interrupted by being hit via other enemies, and they'll just kind of interrupt you and push you back, and then it's kind of slow going as a result of that. But if you've built into your defensive capabilities and you have the melee skill to back it up, melee weapons are incredibly lethal. But if you want to get the most out of it, I think you need to combine it with disciplines. Disciplines are where the fun of combat really comes from, leaning fully into whatever it is your character is intended to do. Celerity is an easy one, just massively reducing the speed of all the other enemies obviously makes all of the rest of combat easier because they don't get a chance to hit you back, which given how the rest of combat plays out might be extremely advantageous, and it's no wonder why that's a popular way to play it then. Personally, I love the unique stuff like thaumaturgy, being able to just use various blood powers to either shield yourself or boil enemies alive or steal their blood directly from their veins as an example and just take it back for yourself as they die is just a really fun way to play. Potence is great for its simplicity, but other skills that are more, let's say, situational, like for instance, Obfuscate, which can help you get those stealth kills in situations where other characters just wouldn't be able to get them, as an example, would be really fun. The unique Gangrel discipline, Protean, which turns you into one of those wolf guys that has all that extra unarmed damage via their claws and whatnot, is another really fun way to play. So to say combat is unenjoyable would just not be true, but gameplay-wise, it's also just not very good. Everything down to, just like hit detection, trying to target things, the overall balancing of it. Some things are just wildly better than others, and it's not even close. And for that reason, especially in like the basic versions of the game where you have these incredibly difficult boss fights that are going to be mandatory in a lot of the endings, you're setting yourself up for a rough experience. And if anything's going to bring down your enjoyment of this game, I would be willing to bet it's going to be one of the combat sequences here, and be that trying to deal with fighting your way through the Warrens for the first time, or fighting Ming Zhao as an example. It's going to hit you at some point that the system is definitely the game's weakest point in an otherwise fantastic RPG. And to look to the future, that is actually one area I'm just not really worried about Bloodlines 2 being better than Bloodlines 1, because the bar for combat being better is basically on the floor, guys. If they give you some fun abilities in Bloodlines 2, congrats, they've pretty much won already. Everything else, RPG elements, sure, we'll talk. I don't think they can replicate this flash in the pan, at least easily in that regard. But in terms of combat, again, it's very hard not to do better than this. But ultimately, what you get out of combat is going to depend on your exact setup and your stats and everything, but I think if you really try to implement and find a discipline that you like in terms of a certain clan, you'll more than likely have a fun enough time with it. That brings us to the Steam Deck section. I always include this in my reviews. You can play the patched version of Vampire the Masquerade here on the Steam Deck. You just have to go to the desktop mode and actually install the unofficial patch that way. There's some guides and stuff online if you want to figure out how to do that for yourself. I'm not going to bother with it, but if you are willing to put in the work to get it set up and running, which does take a little bit extra compared to just buying it on Steam and downloading it as an example, then it can be done, but just understand you're likely going to have to actually put in some work to get it playing on that platform, but once you do, you should be golden. And that finally brings us to our positives and negatives. So on the positive side of things, the role-playing options, the characters, the way clans change things like dialogues and manage to feel unique, even when you're running through the same content again, having just these different conversations and doing some digging and trying to figure out like who to believe. All of that side of things, the actual RPG side of things, is so well done. And I think it's the best part of Bloodlines overall, and it is not close. Combine that with just the memorable characters and everything, and it's no surprise that over time, Bloodlines eventually became this really big cult classic hit, propped up by word of mouth and some incredibly dedicated fans. And it's exactly because of all of that that I think people are extremely worried about the overall reception of Bloodlines 2 all these years later, which we'll simply have to see about. But in spite of that, as you've probably, noticed here, Bloodlines 1 has a way of being sort of mythologized in some respects, and as a result, I think that can sort of mask some of the game's faults. For starters, combat is by far and away the easiest one. It's just incredibly janky, but there's also other smaller moments where they kind of drop the ball. Like, for instance, what I was talking about with Jeanette and Velvet, they're very clearly talking to you, the player, and not the actual character. And while this game is not afraid to occasionally break the fourth wall with these really cheesy moments, like when the Sabbat attack you at the end of the first act, the issue there is that those moments feel like they're just kind of in a different game, to be honest. They don't really belong. And it's when stuff like that happens that I think the game is actually at its weakest, even when that stuff is super memorable. Because as much as I'm complaining about that right now, I'm sure I will get at least one comment saying that I'm wrong about that, and actually Velvet is the super memorable character for all these reasons, and I'm sure there's at least two of them on screen. Even ignoring all that stuff, though, there's then the sort of back half of the game where you could tell they were clearly, trying to wrap things up, and unfortunately weren't able to in the original released version. But simply put, the game starts off really great with all these robust options for completing basically everything, and then the farther in you get, the less options you have available to you, with the option you are given typically being to just, fight your way through, which, depending on your setup or the way you wanted to play the game, might not necessarily be fitting. And again, an easy example there is you can easily play a Toreador very socially and combat averse throughout much of the beginning of the game, and then all of a sudden towards the end you have no choice but to fight these individual characters. And it's moments like that where, regardless of the patch being there or not, that it kind of just feels sloppy as a result. Now, honestly, I think people are more than happy to forgive stuff like that. Given the entire history of this game and its development, it's no surprise then that people are pretty forgiving of those things. And in fact, if you can look past them, there's an incredible experience to be had here. But make no mistake, this game does have some pretty glaring flaws. They just don't overpower how well the game does everything else in the patched up versions. Which brings me to my conclusion. Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines is an interesting game to talk about, both because of its history and the cult following that it's garnered over these years and all these things that it does really, really well. Combine that with, again, the sort of flash in the pan time in which it was made and how it was made, there is just nothing else quite like this game out there. It is not something I think that could be replicated even if you wanted to replicate it. And I think that's a big reason why it sticks with people so much. This is a very unique experience that you really just can't get anywhere else. Even all of these years later, even with all of its flaws, there's just something about Bloodlines that scratches an itch no other game can. And it's really a remarkable story from start to finish, both from its development to modders and things kind of saving it from the ashes, as an example. And simply put, when it comes to this sequel that is launching in a month, I don't think there's really much of any game that could truly live up to this game's legacy. I'm hoping the sequel is good and enjoyable in its own right, and I think that's why it is, to this day, one of the best vampire games out there. So, regardless of what else happens with this sequel or whatever, if you get the chance, you should absolutely play Bloodlines 1 for yourself. It's a remarkable game and a unique experience, and I think that's about the best recommendation you could give something, but do be aware, even with all those fixes, it's still a flawed experience. And with that, I think I'm going to wrap up this video finally, as I've been talking forever. I certainly hope you enjoyed it. If you did, by all means, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. This one was honestly a lot of work, so I would appreciate it if you shared it. Hoping this gets a little traction ahead of the sequel's release, as it felt like a good time to redo it, mind you. But honestly, regardless of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.